All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us here today. This is the second session in our Global Perspective series, but the premiere of this ongoing Attainable Housing series, which will be a catalyst for future sessions. For those of you who don't know Intuitive, we've got 7 offices across Canada, the US, and the UK. We're a purpose-driven firm of engineers, designers, technologists, and city building experts who deliver uncompromising performance through a range of comprehensive solutions for the built environment. We believe in a sustainable future. I'm David Leonard, an associate with Intuitive, based in the Calgary office with a focus on building enclosures and facades. I've worked on all types of projects and buildings all over the continent, and when I got this opportunity to moderate this series, I jumped at it. It's certainly something that I'm very passionate about, and I'm happy to share some of the knowledge that we can pull from this panel today. Our firm has a strong commitment to doing our part to contribute to attainable housing projects across the housing continuum. We're proud to be a part of the housing projects that we get to work on. According to the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, housing is considered to be affordable when a household spends less than 30% of its pre-tax income on adequate shelter. This is commonly solely associated with subsidized or low-income housing. And we want to break the mold and share what opportunities might be existing that haven't fully been explored yet. We acknowledge that there's no silver bullet to solve the challenges of every or any market, but rather a dialogue that should be had around what challenges may exist or what opportunities that could be explored to create and maintain economical, social, sustainable, and efficient housing that's attainable for everyone. So to summarize our objectives today, it's not just a one aspect or area, but really an intro into the topic before we explore different areas in more detail. So we'll look at the following: defining affordable housing, the effects of the pandemic, of course, creating well-being and positive impacts with attainable housing, how we can elevate the industry across the whole housing continuum, and what opportunities exist in attainable housing. So a couple of weeks ago, I had the chance to sit down with our panelists and heard their passion about what they're working on. We easily could have spoken for hours. Unfortunately, we cut it short and only talked for about an hour, so we'll get a chance to talk with everyone a little bit more today, but I'd like to introduce you to each of our panelists. First, we have Ahmed Tagani. He's the Deputy Commissioner, Office of Neighborhood Strategies with the New York Department of Housing and Preservation Development in New York, USA. We have Ian Underwood, the CEO with Habitat for Humanity for the Greater Toronto Area, based obviously in Toronto. Jeff Linus, who's a principal with MTA Urban Design Architecture Interior Design, based in Calgary. Lillian Chow, who's the Director of Community Real Estate with Brightside Community Homes Foundation, based in Vancouver, BC. And we have Sarah Woodgate, who's the President of Calgary Housing Company and the Director of Calgary Housing with the City of Calgary, again, based here in Calgary. So we will have time for Q&A at the end. For anyone who has any questions that they would like brought to the panel, feel free to submit those directly to Allison or the Intuitive Events person on our call here today. We will be recording the event and we'll be sending a recording and some take-homes in the coming weeks, so please stay tuned. So let's get this thing kicked off. So everyone has a different definition of attainable housing. How would you define it and how would you play a role in creating it? Ahmed, if we could start with you.
Absolutely, and I would thank you for inviting me to be part of this discussion and having the opportunity to talk about this. I think this is obviously an incredible and critical piece to, as a city, New York City, what it means to make sure that we are truly building an equitable city. You know, access to safe, comfortable, and affordable homes are part of the unquestionable truths behind the work of what we're doing here in New York City. When Mayor de Blasio came into office in 2014, he set a very ambitious goal to make sure that we're helping New Yorkers obtain and keep affordable housing. And so he set a very high goal. First, we started off at 200,000 homes by 2026, and then he upped the ante to 300,000 homes by 2026. What's basically pushing that is a engine of HBD development professionals, urban planners, contract professionals who at this point are moving between 25 and 30,000 new units of affordable housing every year to reach our 300,000 unit goal by 2026. And the hurdles are very real, and we'll talk about them more today. But we, and for those who've worked in New York City, know the hurdles very well. The cost and availability of capital and financing, construction and material costs, the availability of just land to build in in dense urban environments like New York. These are factors these factors have fed to an affordability crisis that has left people in every neighborhood, in every place, struggling to make ends meet. My role specifically is to work with very talented. I'm very lucky to be surrounded by the people I am who have this knowledge, and we're all working to leverage our public land, our assets. We're using housing vouchers, we're using public-private partnership, we're using different forms of subsidy, mixing and matching it so that our goals are aligned. And at the heart of this, we're trying to create attainable housing and reverse the destabilizing of some neighborhoods that we're seeing this affordable housing crisis contribute to. And this strategy is across multiple fronts where we're simultaneously trying to build more homes for seniors. We're working with tenant advocates to protect our existing housing stock, whether it's not allowing violations and undermining building conditions to basically take those units offline, and then putting money and investing money to do extensive rehab, and if need be, putting vouchers so that people can afford to live there. We're looking at different models of shared equity. So whether that's limited liability corporations and co-ops or community land trusts, that's one angle that we think will help bedrock both our extra low, moderate, and middle income class New Yorkers for decades to come. And ultimately, at the end of the day, we are delivering all of this understanding that as these hurdles become, they're only getting more difficult. Even during the pandemic, which had its own set of challenges, we are still simultaneously just adding and piling on to our obstacles. So I guess the definition of attainable housing is, for us, making sure we're getting to that equitable city, and regardless of the challenges, meeting all the different types of housing I mentioned, and all the different types of equity and shared land ownership that I mentioned earlier.
Awesome, thanks, Ahmed. Ian, how about you? Oh, you're on mute. That won't be the last time.
I had to be one of us.
Yeah.
I think of a couple dimensions with this notion of attainable. So, the first is that it's appropriate to a household's needs, appropriate in terms of the size, the geographic location, the safety kind of and health aspects of the home itself, the community it's in. So there's one dimension. And the other you touched on is that it's affordable. It's that you have enough money left over for other household needs. And therefore, if you have those two things, home can be a base from which you and your family can get ahead, right? Can progress, can thrive. So for us at Habitat for Humanity, the piece of attainable housing that we focus on is helping families in particular who are lower income have a home that is appropriate to their needs, that have their expenses be affordable to their income, and then on the thriving side, we're a home ownership model. So we're basically enabling families to take what would have otherwise been rent and have it become a mortgage, so they have the adequacy of the home, but the ability to build generational wealth for the next generation. So in essence, that's what we do. We do it, as you said, within the Greater Toronto Area. In our case, which is a dubious distinction of now being the fifth least affordable housing market in the world, second least affordable in North America, second to Vancouver. And so what that means is, for lower income and workers, and for the majority of our essential workers, they do not have access to attainable housing. So they are living in housing that holds them back because it's crowded, because it's too expensive, because it's too far away to commute, because it's substandard. So attainable lets you move forward. It doesn't hold you back.
That's great. Jeff, we'll move it over to you.
Well, I think you'll hear some themes from all of us coming through, and building on what the last two panelists said is I really look at attainable housing as simply this. It is a foundational element from Maslow's hierarchy. Looking at shelter as a basic physiological need, and so with attainable housing, it is something that is essential to ensure that you can get stability through yourself as an individual, a quality of life for your families, and even through the greater communities. And I think as a practicing architect, I believe that we as a profession have the skill set, but also the responsibility to design our built environment that can provide a state of equity for all of us as human beings. And when you look at attainable housing and what it means, as others have said, if you have that stable house or that stable area of shelter, there are so many other aspects of your life that can have the proper focus. But without a sense of attainable housing, all of those other elements come into play, and can be quite challenging for anybody.
Great, thank you. Lillian, over to you.
Hi, everybody. First, I'd like to acknowledge that I am coming to you from the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish people here in Vancouver. And when I think about attainable housing, this is actually a very relevant point. I think of it as creating equitable access to housing. So Ahmed talked about that already. And here in Canada, like one stark example is that there's a very different access to equitable and affordable housing on reserve and off reserve, very simply from that. And we also know that the data is showing that there are specific racialized groups, and Annie talked about different income groups and different working groups. But when you're talking about new immigrants, seniors, female-headed households, Indigenous households, we know that those groups are disproportionately affected and have major barriers to actually accessing housing. And so I think it's really important for us to actually recognize that you need to think about attainable housing in a disaggregated way, that we need to look at the data and look at who's being impacted, who's the housing being built for, to really understand how we can break down those barriers. And quite frankly, for me, attainable housing from an equitable perspective really means a commitment to social justice, right? So if everybody has access to the housing that is appropriate for them, like Anna had said, that means that we need to break down those systemic biases, racism, other barriers that prevents people from that the same economic situation as others, and accessing affordable housing. Those are types of things that we need to actually break down as we continue to build more affordable housing in our communities. So at the end of the day, for me, attainable housing actually really means social justice.
Great, thanks, Lillian. And last but certainly not least, Sarah.
Thanks, David. I think that this has been a really good coverage so far. And as an urban planner, I think my initial focus on housing was really the bricks and mortar, the architecture, the design. But the more that I've moved into professional practice as a chartered member of the Institute of Housing, it really is about people. And so it's a really fascinating area to work, because attainable housing is about having housing available that's appropriate, suitable, and provides a choice for everyone to have a home in order so that they can have a foundation to thrive. And in Calgary, we have such a different market. It's such a great panel, but we actually have a lot of advantages in Calgary because we have very favorable construction costs compared to my colleague on the panel in New York and Vancouver and Toronto. We actually only have 4% of our population overspending on housing that earn $80,000 a year and above. So in Calgary, our focus is we have 100,000 households by 2024 who will be overspending and have significant challenges with housing choice. They earn $65,000 a year and less. And so Our focus is on low and moderate income households and understanding who those households are, what the barriers are. And attainable housing is really about both income and people's financial stability and their personal situation, as well as housing availability. So it's a very, very big topic, and I'm really glad to be here with you to talk about the different strategies. Attainable housing is really different in every area, every market, whether you're northern, rural, urban. The situation is different, but there are tools and there are levers that we can all use, and you can apply those tools and levers as best as possible to help increase the capacity of the housing sector to serve people better through housing. And so I'm excited to talk about that today.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So I don't think we can hold one of these webinars at this point in time without talking about the pandemic really quick. So Ian, we'll start with you. By now, we've all had time to absorb the effects of the pandemic on our economy, our industries, and our mental and physical well-being. And how has the pandemic impacted your organization and your ability to create attainable housing?
Yeah, so I think Sarah and a couple others have already, of course, touched on the pandemic. How can we not? And I think for all of us, it's been a really mixed bag in terms of what's the impact of the pandemic on the work we do, the aspirations that everyone listening to this call have about attainable housing. On one hand, I think the number of people who have talked about how much they appreciate their homes. We've never had a year where, it's internalized how important home is. On the other hand, it's also caused, way more attention to our homeless populations, because people can see that, they can translate being in a shelter in dorm accommodation is not going to be healthy. So it's caused a degree of, okay, let's try to address that. It has also, as we know, had widened the income and wealth gaps that lie underneath this whole housing conversation. And we all know this, right? That the lower income populations were disproportionately lost jobs, lost hours, lost income, took on more debt. Those at higher incomes have huge cash reserves. In Canada, the 44 Canadian billionaires are $63 billion better off now than before the pandemic. So, it has widened the challenge for us to address the need. I think it's fair to say, and we saw these in the health results, of our lower income and racialized populations disproportionately affected by COVID-19. And so the hardships that come with not having attainable housing are greater, and the path to them are greater. For us at Habitat for Humanity, I'm going to pick up on what Lillian talked about. The other part of this 18 months is it's brought us all into a conversation about anti-Black systemic racism and systemic racism in general. For us at Habitat for Humanity, that we've actually partnered with the Black North Initiative, which is a Canadian initiative around anti-Black systemic racism, and our finding it's helping us change the channel a bit in conversations with philanthropists and with governments to understand that when we talk about housing, this is not just about roof over your head. I think Sarah made the point, or Lillian did, this is about social justice. This is about racial inclusion. And so in our case, we've been working with Black North on a Black North homeownership bridge program that would mobilize all levels of government, philanthropists, developers, to create pathways for more members of the Black community, not just to have that roof over their head, but to have what 69% of Canadian households have, and that is home ownership and the opportunity to build generational wealth. So it's changing the conversation, but there's no question the hardship is higher for the folks we're talking about. The stretch is bigger for those of us as leaders in this conversation on how creative and imaginative and intentional do we need to be as a society in getting real and addressing these issues.
Yeah, for sure. It's a conversation. I think it's a hard one, but it definitely needs to be had. Lillian, maybe same question over to you.
Sure. I think, I love what En just said. And so I'm going to take a slightly different perspective on this, because I think a lot of great things have already been said. One of the things is, I would say for us, Brightside, we're building, redeveloping our existing portfolio. We have 26 buildings and we're currently doing 4 new projects. And one of the things that we found is that when you're designing affordable housing, we're looking for resiliency. And I think through COVID, it was really clear that social connectedness, people's access to space, either shared space or their own individual space, the size of units, amenities, things like that are, so important to people's lives and livability and to their mental health. And so when we were looking at our buildings and looking to see if there's any changes that we need to make, we were actually really happy to know that, our priorities is providing larger amenity spaces, places for people to connect, and actually balconies for all units. And those types of things actually, I think, weathered quite well through COVID, because those are some of the design features that you want to have given, kind of the pandemic situation, and be resilient into the future. So I think for us, it was, I think, well, pretty much, I think for any builder to understand how you build that community, how do you build a resilient building. And I think COVID really helped us really look at those things again and make sure that they can last for the future.
Oh, that's great. And maybe Sarah will put it over to you.
Thanks. Just building on that, I think those are really good comments, as there's kind of 2 streams. I am the president of Calgary Housing Company, and we provide homes to 25,000 Calgarians every day. And so one of the elements of the pandemic that really became heightened is we do a lot of work in eviction prevention. So a huge amount of resources go into understanding the underlying causes of eviction, and working on changes to improve those underlying causes, and also directly with residents who are experiencing challenges maintaining housing stability. Housing stability is so important. Building a home is the first step, and then helping people be successful in the home is equally important. And so our eviction prevention processes really were ramped up. The primary reason people lose housing and rental housing is generally because of income challenges, debt, and an inability to make rent payments. And so really looking at that and being able to adjust and have payment plans and a strong communication and coordinated supports is a very important process of attainable housing. So it's more than just attaining a house, it's also about keeping a house. On the city of Calgary side, I'm also responsible for affordable housing for the city of Calgary. And when the pandemic happened, we were really focused on supporting the sector that was serving people who don't have a home. That became very obvious in the pandemic, as discussed in the panel. And so we were able to coordinate with all the nonprofits a plan that went to City Council as a community plan to say, how can we have diversion? There were about 2,000 individuals experiencing homelessness that were diverted to housing through the crisis. And this can happen every day, all the time, if housing is a priority. We also brought forward a plan that's a $600 million plan that would actually functionally eliminate homelessness in terms of adding rent supplements and new permanent supportive housing. We did that as a community because we're stronger as a community, working with all the nonprofits, the hotels, the apartment association, to say, if we work together with a plan and we look at how individuals are experiencing their housing situation, we can leverage resources and coordinate so that we can actually have attainable housing for everyone. And so that's some of the work that happened during the pandemic and will continue.
Oh, that's great. So the next thing we have here, Jeff, there's an assumption that affordable housing can't have a positive impact on the occupant's well-being and the fit that the building has within the community it's situated. Do you agree with this? And is there any opportunities or challenges that you see with this?
Yeah, it's like you said, as others have said before, I can't actually disagree with it more. So I think housing, and let's just say say what it is, a right to a stable living environment, does have a massive impact on our physiological and psychological health. And I think these types of projects can actually have more individual and community benefit than, say, the typical market housing. And I think because we are looking at designing these environments with a lens that is more holistic in nature, and you hear Lillian speak on social justice and the like, and I think when building on the pandemic question is, well, what's occurred in our society, at least in North America over the last couple of years, is a bit of a more of an awareness of some of these biases in the economic power system that's there. And I think if we can understand how the levers work on one end, then we can use them to our benefit in terms of designing the built environment. And when we talk about attainable homes and attainable housing, it's really, as everybody has said before, it's about the people, it's about the human condition, it's about establishing equity, a state of reciprocity in our designs, right? That we can give back to the community for which it's situated, and start to use these projects as initiators of more psychological health, right? And so whether or not that is, taking elements like food security, the idea of safety and, safe access to education, et cetera. It all starts with, these types of projects to prove to our society that believe unjustly that there are target populations that don't deserve to have what somebody else has. And I think, if we just have to kind of stop it right there, take a look at it from a completely different lens, build upon what we've had learned from in terms of the COVID situation, and use this as stepping blocks to advance, as I said before in my answer to the first question, housing as a right. Right. And then if we start there and we start to understand that everybody can have a state of equity built into their living environments, we will all benefit. And I think when you understand the fiscal aspects, the social aspects, the cultural aspects, holistically as an entire group, we will be able to get there. But it is a large challenge for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Ahmed, if we could get some of your thoughts on this. You're muted. It's okay. Everyone gets one.
Yeah. I couldn't agree with Jeff more in terms of the orientation and the direction. Very much share the belief that making it, in housing, in New York, right to shelter is something that New Yorkers actually have access to as a right that we extend. And that comes in different forms, but we always want to make sure that when we are thinking about how we're delivering that right in more permanent housing, that we're coming at it from a collaborative nature. So I think the thing I would contribute here is that from a housing agency's perspective, when we are out in the community to talk about how this new built structure will impact it, we have long ago walked away from the idea that this is just an isolated piece that doesn't have a ripple effect. When we came together, this administration came together, we quickly put together a neighborhood playbook that involved all the relevant land use agencies, so that we, from the get-go, would think about a transparent, predictable, and clear way of communicating to all our partners. And our partners are the community stakeholders, are the community boards, the person who lives next door to the proposed site. All of these people are important to the mix of having the conversation from the start about what we are doing here, how it should look, be designed, what the RFP should say, what the mixed uses should be outlined in the plan, so that we are creating something that contributes beyond just units, but bringing in social services or providing a much needed commercial aspect that may not have existed in a neighborhood before, and then laying that out in the plan so that people understand where we're starting, where we're going, how this will be incorporated, and what their role will be as we continue through our process. And so by creating that transparency, people buy into the idea that what they're seeing here is something that actually can benefit them and they can be an active partner. And for us, it's allowed us to build and continue to grow the number of affordable housing units that we have.
Great, thanks. Ian, would like to hear from you on this one.
Yeah, a couple thoughts. I'm actually going to jump to a whole different vantage point on this question of how does housing, attainable housing, benefit all of us. And McKinsey and Company released a study, as a lot of people will be familiar with it, early in 2020, that showed that businesses that have the most diverse workforces and, importantly, the most diverse leadership teams have materially higher performance than less diverse businesses. Now, what does that have to do with housing? It just means it follows as a society, and there's other research that shows this, we do better. We are more creative. We collectively thrive more when we draw on all the talents in the society. So if you're in a home that's holding you back, you're not going to graduate high school, let alone get into that organization and have that path to be in a leadership position to provide the insights and the creativity that you can. So for me, that's a big part of this conversation is we are, as a society, we're all born with this collective talent, but we've harnessed so much of it in inadequate housing that people can't move forward. So I think that's a big part of the story. There's United Way of Greater Toronto had a study a year or so ago, that cited research that says societies with greater social exclusion are more pessimistic, collectively more pessimistic, have greater levels of crime, and it kind of goes on and on. This social justice thing is not just for the people who are left out, it is for having a better society that works better for everyone.
Great, thanks. So Lillian, we've seen a positive change in housing policy in many regions represented on the panel today, including mandatory zoning. What do you think it'll take to get more developers on board to go beyond the minimums?
I think, if you don't mind, I think I want to reframe this question, because I think beyond minimums, I think people should and should do it. But I think in terms of policy, every development has to go through municipal approvals. So policy at that municipal level has a significant impact on really how housing is built, how cost effective it is, and what's the incentive for developers, nonprofit and private, to actually build housing and the appropriate type of housing. And so one comment I would really like to make is that, I've been a practicing planner, similar to Sarah, for over, almost 20 years. And most of that has been in the regulatory role. So I was doing permitting. Now I'm in a nonprofit developer role. And it's really interesting. When I look at the policies that have come forward, the ones that are generally most effective is that they've actually done a couple of things. One, they really identified who the users are and how this policy would benefit them. And two, they actually recognize who might be the ones implementing this policy. So, what I'm talking about specifically is that you may have a policy that is trying to create more affordable housing for low-income seniors, people with disabilities, etc. So that's one user group, right? But at the end of the day, that's what you're trying to create. There's also another group that I think is often considered, but maybe not understood well by planners in particular, are the people that actually build the housing. So people coming through the application process, they actually have to get all the different pieces to actually build the housing. And sometimes what we're finding is those policies are not implementable. And I think so there's a couple of things I think could happen. Some of the best policies I've seen, for example, City of Edmonton actually had, they basically reduced their parking requirements significantly. As part of that policy, they actually did a financial analysis of that. And I've seen other projects where besides you're doing kind of a pure policy review, you're also actually combining that with a financial aspect. So you actually understand what the impacts are when you're actually trying to implement that policy. And I think if planners can actually take a more human-centered design approach, as Sarah said, this is about people. So you're not only caring about the end users, people that are going to live in the housing, you're also looking at the people that are building the housing. and you're actually understanding from there the details of how that actually works. And you're actually doing testing, right? In planning, we often consult. So we consult on some options, but we don't necessarily test a lot. It's like, we kind of narrow it down to one option and like, that's it. And I think doing more testing, even if you're running performas, even you're doing some hypotheticals with your user groups, rather than just asking them, do you think generally this is a good idea? Everybody's going to say that's a great idea, but how you're actually going to make that happen. And so I think for planners, I'm hoping the profession and in planning school that, there's more of us that will be trained to actually do more testing of policies, looking at the financial impacts of these policies, and then end of the day, working with the various groups that actually are either going to be using this policy and being impacted, or actually trying to implement these policies.
Oh, that's great. Sarah, would like to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think obviously developers play a really important role, and I couldn't agree more with the comments. So I'll build from them in terms of really understanding development. In the big picture, when we think about Canada, I do a lot of international work. I'm on International Housing Partnership, and there's a lot to be proud of in Canada. In Calgary, 78% of housing is provided by the private sector, and it's meeting the needs of Calgarians. And so we're focusing on the 22% and saying, are there things that we can put in place to support developers to have a wider reach? What can we do? Other cities actually meet the needs of about 82% of the population, and we have very high income inequality. We have the highest income inequality in Canada. So what can we do to try to support the developers to have a higher reach? Broader reach? And Canada Mortgage Housing Corporation, having the finance and the lending and the insurance, really positions Canada well. We have a very strong development sector. And when we look at England, they only have a handful of developers for the entire country, and their conversations are focused on needing hundreds and hundreds of thousands of units for the regular average population. And so when we look at policy and how to amend it, it's really important to have partnerships. However, we can't expect the development industry to make up the gaps where the finances don't work. People's incomes are clearly not high enough to provide a home. The average rent of social housing in Calgary is $320 a month, including utilities. And so that's not something that you can innovate with a private developer because that's the cost the household can afford. And so I think it's about leveraging the strengths of every sector. And this is also where the nonprofit sector comes in. The nonprofit sector in Calgary has very strong partnerships. We've heard a little bit about philanthropy here. There's a lot of opportunity to leverage and reduce all of the barriers and costs to develop in order to provide that home to an individual where the private sector can't reach it, but they build it. And really working with them to understand how to make it possible to build is so important. And so it really is about partnerships.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. Jeff, if you could share your thoughts on this.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and I would say I agree with what everybody has said, but really is looking at how do we bridge that fiscal gap that's there, right? And so the way we see it as well at kind of being later down the line, and what we're trying to advocate for as designers, architects, planners, etc., is that yes, it's front end loading the decision making process that involves the multitude of perspectives required to make the right decision. It's not necessarily only fiscally based, or it's not only policy based, because if we look at something through an individual lens, we'll absolutely obviously miss something. The challenge, I would say, is that because we have this fiscal gap in Canada, and it is requiring a lot of federal grant funding to get some of these projects off the ground that have very tight fiscal return targets as it stands, right? And when you look at some of the requirements that are associated with the federal funding, the requirements here, at least in Canada, are higher than the market developer would have to obtain, for a similar type product that would actually charge the occupant a higher rate. And so if we can look at how we can do something that either mandates the requirements of the federal funding to be applied to the market, or look at how, to sort of equal that playing field from the beginning, or even just, having more inclusive types of discussions so that we can craft policy together that we know can be implemented and it will have a positive return.
Great, thanks, Jeff. So back to you, Sarah. Where's the biggest opportunity to create more attainable housing right now that you'd see?
So I have a couple of buckets on this, and the one that most people kind of focus on is supply. One of the challenges we have right now in Canada is we need to protect the supply. Most of the housing stock in our country that was created in the 60s, 70s, post-war boom to support Canadians is old. And so we have a very significant aging housing, social housing and rental housing in Calgary. And protecting supply is important. In fact, being able to acquire existing rental and have it maintained as existing rental is really important, because we actually probably will be building less new supply than what will be lost through conversion to higher cost housing as those apartments are purchased and then renovated and repaired and offered at a very high rents or high condo costs. And so protecting supply is the first thing that needs to happen. And a lot more investment in, you can double the life cycle of a lot of the stock. We can fully upgrade, envelope, and repair the full interior of a unit.
Oh, I think we might have frozen Sarah up there. All right, we'll maybe go to you, Lillian.
Actually, do you mind maybe Ahmed or Ene? I feel like I've chatted a lot in the last.
Sure, yeah, we can go to Ahmed if you'd prefer. We can jump in.
Absolutely. So building off actually from the last question and where I think Sarah was going, for us, the two areas of opportunity we see in an urban environment like New York is through looking at mandatory housing, mandatory inclusionary zoning, which is something that we launched earlier in administration, 2016, with the partnership of the City Council and through an extensive policy and financial analysis to make sure that that was something that actually could weather the market and stand to deliver actual housing units in New York City, which it has. It goes back to something else that we talked about, which is how do you bring these new changes to create attainable housing and for New York, we actually have a majority as of right market versus a discretionary decision-making process. My job mostly focuses on the discretionary decision-making process where we go through approvals, but for the most part, a lot of our development, 80 to 90%, actually happens as of right based on whatever the standing rules are. So we are trying to figure out how to create attainable housing in an as-of-right market by setting new rules and making sure that the housing can be developed and be financially strong. And then also through our discretionary projects, trying to figure out how to pull that together and align and create more attainable housing that way. And layered on top of those two pieces, we want to make sure that there's actual planning going on as an urban planner myself, that there are discussions about when we're building this new housing, that what the wraparound context is. What are the community services? What are the public infrastructure improvements? And alongside this strategy, it all comes together in these neighborhood rezonings that we do, and we saw that as an opportunity to set a marker for the future, creating thousands of new units of housing, launching brand new opportunities to redevelop and re-envision publicly owned sites into affordable housing, to encourage a market, the as of right market, to create new mixed income housing under the as of right model, and then create a neighborhood plan that puts in hundreds of millions of dollars of new public infrastructure and commitments to services that those existing communities have not seen for decades. So, that is something that we see as a continued opportunity right now. We're looking at building off a separate but very important process, going back to something Ian said earlier, where we we were already thinking thoughtfully about this, but we were looking very critically at the issue of access, wealth gap, equity, and fair housing. And so at the end of last year, we announced our Where We Live plan that sets out a pretty ambitious larger vision of what fair housing in New York City could look like. And that means making sure that people have access to high opportunity areas, making sure that people have access to those areas that already have built up public infrastructure or strong schools or an abundance of green space. And so in those high opportunity areas, we want to build more affordable housing. And we currently have 2 neighborhood rezonings that follow the same model I just talked about in the Gowanus, Brooklyn neighborhood, in Soho, Gowanus, Brooklyn, and in Soho, Manhattan, legendary neighborhoods in their own right, where we are both mixing affordable housing, we're mixing community infrastructure, we're looking at dealing with decades-old environmental remediation that would be critical to seeing the neighborhoods grow and prosper. And it's, for us, that is really important. Those are really important opportunities to pursue. And then just to say quickly about where Sarah is, our housing stock, same situation where we have a very old housing stock that we see both opportunities to put in money to preserve and maintain that existing housing as affordable housing through regulatory contracts, which we do as a large part of the 300,000 plans, about 2/3 of how we plan to get and retain our affordable housing. And then we also have affordable housing that was through a limited liability process where they agreed to stay affordable for a certain amount of time. And so we continuously re-engage and we find ways to recapture those units and maintain and keep them in affordable position longer. And, Habitat New York, just to shout out for them, they're an incredible partner and they work with us a lot on home ownership as a way to, under that subset, look for opportunities to bridge the wealth gap, to look for shared equity, because we understand coming out of the pandemic, coming out of years of inequity, that we need to find more opportunities to make sure that, especially communities of color that didn't have as much access as before, that we're putting money into creating that type of asset for them. So whether it be homeownership, whether it be different variations of cooperative living or community land trusts, those are also opportunities that we're actively pursuing and trying to grow.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Ahmed. Ian, over to you.
I think this question of what's the most powerful thing we can do to address attainable housing, it's so evident from our responses. Man, it's complicated, and yet I think in some respects we need to have a rudder on this. We need to ground ourselves in having an orientation that says the focus when we think of any housing related policy needs to be on the people who are excluded and on the future generations. And sadly, as we know, our policies today are more focused on and influenced by those who are already advantaged. So I think, and again, that's because we have limited democratic societies. But so I think, what does that mean? If we were focused more on people who are excluded on the future generations, I'll give you 2 examples. The first is Sarah picked up on housing supply. We got to make it easier to build more stuff. I think all of us relate to this. I'm not a planner, but it feels to me like when we're trying to get, or a private developer getting something approved, first, we worry about the parks, we worry about heritage, we worry about community character, we worry about traffic, we worry about schools, we worry about everything. And then if there's still room to deal with the affordable housing, then we fit it in. So, and that, number one, takes a long time. Number two, doesn't get us the outcomes around people are excluded and future generations. So somehow we need to be brave in unraveling some of the complexity we've created. Flipping to a very different side of this, saying we need to say this is a basic human right, and we need to pay attention to people who are very advantaged by housing. So again, this will be controversial, but in Canada we have capital gains taxes, and if you live in a house that is $5 million, you don't need the entire capital gain from the sale of that house. We should be able to place caps on capital gain taxes, on property taxes. in Toronto, even in Toronto, if you live in a $2.5 million house, it's probably bigger than you need and on a bigger space of land than makes sense to the future. So we should talk about having premiums of property taxes, premiums on land transfer taxes for homes that are like, knock yourself out if you want and if that's important to you, but there's a premium, not having it based on the same mill rate as for the person that's in a $900,000 house or in a 500 square foot, $600,000 condo. So there are things we can do that are very intentional, but they take bravery and they need to be focused on who is excluded and who will be affected by these decisions in the future, which is our children and grandchildren. So complicated, but we need a rudder.
Absolutely. Jeff, we'll throw it over to you.
Totally agree. And I think at the end of the day, we got to look at it from this, perspective, is that there's been a power structure in place, that, at the end of the day, you have to consciously change your perspective, or at least try to do it by being empathetic. So it's not being sympathetic, it's not being compassionate, it's not looking at, talking about, people that are less fortunate. It's about actually trying to put yourself in their shoes. And a lot of times the individuals, and I can say probably a number of us on the panel are not necessarily in the position to feel these strains on a day-to-day basis, even if we have in our lives. That at the end of the day, this is a conscious choice that we can make. So when we're talking about the biggest opportunity, we can decide to build one less freeway and solve the housing crisis in a blink of an eye. But I would say all of us as practitioners, whether or not we're developers or planners or architects or even just citizens, if we start speaking with one voice, that voice will become louder and louder, and put enough pressure to make that fundamental change. And I think, one of the things that you've seen, I would hope, and I am hopeful that, seeing how our society has become more aware in the last number of years on a number of issues. I wouldn't necessarily say that we've acted on it sufficiently enough yet, but there is that awareness there, that if we can harness that, as a collective and push forward, then I think we do have an ability to create more, attainable housing and start from the ground up, rather than, trying to mitigate from the top down.
Oh, thanks, Jeff. And Lillian, we're not going to let you off the hook on this one. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on this last question.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And just thanks for all the discussion. For me right now, this is the time to build a more attainable housing. We've got federal, provincial, municipal governments that are now on board, realize this is a major problem. Finally, after 30 years, there's now reinvestment into housing. And this includes new financing programs. They're not without risk, for sure, for the nonprofit. So for some of these programs like BC Housing, that's a fully subsidized program, which is great. And then you got CMHC's co-investment, you've got the RCFI, which really does provide other incentives, especially if you're doing projects without any government subsidy. So now there's an alternative. And then you got Housing Investment Corporation, which Sarah sits on, and that's a great alternative. And that's actually getting investors from out in the capital markets to actually invest in affordable housing. And to me, those are really great ways of actually, in some ways, shifting how we finance affordable housing and shifting the way that we think about investing our money. And what I think is actually missing right now, I think it's a great opportunity to grow, is social impact investments. So is there a way that we can get philanthropists, individuals, community members to be able to invest in affordable housing projects in their community through a community bond or a social impact bond of some sort? So you get some financial return, but you're also getting a significant social return. We know this has been done before. There's groups in Toronto, actually, Tapestry Capital has been doing this with different nonprofit groups for housing and other programs. And then we also, other groups have used this to create social purpose real estate. So I feel like, there is some federal, I think, focus right now on social investments out there. And I think this is an area that I think I would love to see grow and create that infrastructure, particularly in BC, because I think we have lots of projects that could have some additional capital. So I think it's in some ways shifting how people look at investments. I think shifting away of not just a purely financial return, but also a social return. So I would love to see that grow and create, more capital for us to actually build more deeply affordable housing. As we heard today, that is something that we're definitely short of, and would definitely go a long way in creating more equitable access to housing in our communities.
Oh, that's great. Thanks, Lillian. Sarah, since you got cut off there, we'll give you the last word here.
I don't know what I said wrong, but just to wrap it up, I absolutely agree. I think we have to rethink and prioritize housing as a very important factor of being in Canada. And if we're not careful, I'm not sure how many future generations will have an opportunity for home ownership, and that we really need to look at those caps. And if we can have just unfettered markets in housing so that our future generations can live there. Couple practical tools. We need to coordinate processes and approvals to make it easy to develop housing. The City of Calgary has supported 5,000 units since 2016 by removing all of the barriers that are in place to have affordable housing, providing land at book value to nonprofits, making it a consistent price, offering the land, expedited approvals. Time is money for developers. Being able to develop housing in 3 to 6 months for planning approvals gets it going fast. Having grants and waiving fees for development opportunities, being able to have in-kind labor at the municipal level that leverages federal, provincial. The biggest gap is capital equity and grants. We can't finance our way out of affordable housing for really low income people. We need more federal and provincial support to put capital. Mixed income housing is a very phenomenal solution for equity and diversity and inclusion of neighborhoods. However, we do need capital equity into it. We can build mixed income housing, and we can actually have no operating subsidy required. The other piece, though, is housing benefits and income supplements for people that are low income, and some kind of guaranteed income across Canada. It's not just about housing and building, it's about having ways in order to have a better system. We can help people thrive. Calgary Housing Company has 1,500 households that move out every single year. Most of those are going to private sector and affordable home ownership, 100 homeowners a year. The more that we focus on tools to support individual housing success, the less we'll need to build low-income housing. That's my wrap up. Thanks.
No, that's great. Thanks, Sarah. So we've got a question here from Caitlin Maloney. We'll throw it to you, Ian. So it's been mentioned a goal of attainable housing is intended to raise people up and help them break out of the disadvantaged cycle. From that perspective, then, is attainable housing intended to be temporary or permanent, or for more generation?
Yeah, I think others may want to comment, but I think the answer is it depends. If you're cycling this afternoon and you're hit by a truck and you are never going to walk again or have use of your upper body or lower body, you may, and if you don't have insurance, you may well need support for the rest of your life in terms of what you can afford in housing. If using Sarah's example, you've been, had life circumstances that have you living in potentially subsidized housing or affordable rental housing, but you're enabled to kind of move forward, then you can move away from that. Certainly in our model at Habitat for Humanity, our intention is entirely we're enabling people to build that generational wealth so they themselves may be able to move on to market housing, or move, or their children will be able to. But I think going back to where we started, attainable housing, is born really out of the United Nations, declaration that housing is a basic human right, regardless of your circumstances. And so in some of our centers, that will mean we as a society are always supporting you. And in many other situations, it will mean that you are being supported so that you in turn can support others. So I hope that answers the question you were raising. The ambition is everyone gets to thrive in whatever definition that is for them.
Great, thanks, Ian. Yeah, I've seen quite a few people drop off here. I know we're a little bit past the hour. So what we'll do, we did get a lot of great questions. So what we'll do is circulate those with the panelists and certainly try to respond to everyone's questions here. Thank you today and to the panelists and to the audience. I think this is an important discussion that obviously I think we need to be having more of, and sometimes it can be uncomfortable or may not seem relevant to you, but it's really something I think that we're all in this together. It's really going to have a positive impact, I think, on society as a whole. So just a reminder that we're recording the session today and takeaways will be sent out to everyone in the coming weeks. Just a reminder that this is the first in our Attainable Housing series. So if you'd like to participate in future events, we'll be sharing more info on how you can participate in our follow-up emails. This is also the second of several events in Intuitive's Global Perspective series. So stay tuned for events on building renewal, sustainability, timber, and healthcare coming this fall. Thanks again and have a great day.